Welcome to Proving the Point, where we discuss important research papers that you should know about. Today I'm going to discuss this paper called Does the High Prevalence of Vitamin D Deficiency in African Americans Contribute to Health Disparities? So, if you don't know, African Americans and other dark-skinned people have much higher rates of vitamin D deficiency because vitamin D, that's the vitamin that we get with the help of the sun. And differences in skin tone across the different human populations basically leads to different bioavailability of vitamin D. So the way that it works is in your skin, you have the precursor to vitamin D, and energy from the sunlight, specifically ultraviolet light, penetrates the skin and converts that precursor molecule into something else, which then gets transported through the blood to other organs like the liver and then the kidney, where it's transformed into the active form of vitamin D. And then from there, vitamin D gets transported throughout the bloodstream where it goes to our different cells and our different organs. It enters our cells and then it helps regulate like thousands of different genes. So it turns different genes on or off to control cell and organ function. And so if you don't have enough vitamin D, your organs and your cells, they're not going to function properly, and you're predisposed to a lot of different health problems, which we're going to talk about in this paper. Okay, so the reason that people with darker skin have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency, specifically when they're living in high latitude countries away from the equator, again, it has to do with skin tone. So you need ultraviolet light from the sun in order to produce vitamin D, but darker skin blocks ultraviolet light, okay, because you don't want too much ultraviolet light. If you have too much ultraviolet light hitting your skin, it can damage the DNA and promote skin cancer. So darker skin is an adaptation to climates where sunlight is much higher and ultraviolet light exposure is much higher. Okay, in those populations, they're constantly exposed to ultraviolet light, and so they produce a lot of melanin in their skin, which is a pigment that basically darkens the skin and then blocks ultraviolet light. And so this protects their skin cells from DNA damage, and they still have plenty of sun in those climates to get the adequate amount of vitamin D that they need. But when they move to northern climates, like in Europe or North America, okay, they're not getting enough sunlight anymore. So whereas like white people or people with lighter colored skin, they're able to get plenty of vitamin D because they're not producing the melanin to block ultraviolet light, at least not at the same amount of melanin. But Africans and other dark-skinned people, they're not able to produce, rather, they're not able to get enough ultraviolet light to make enough vitamin D. Okay? So we're going to talk about that. We're going to talk about why it matters and how it might lead to differences in health outcomes between African Americans, as we'll see, Hispanic Americans and white Americans. Okay, so before we get into it, the reason that this paper matters is, again, there's a lot of health disparities by race and ethnicity in the United States and in Europe, where white people tend to be healthier by a variety of metrics, and Africans and other dark-skinned people tend to do worse by a variety of metrics. That's everything from metabolic diseases to kidney diseases to hypertension and things like that. And the narrative to explain this, at least a growing narrative, is that this is all because of like white racism or institutional racism or things like that. Basically, the idea is that dark-skinned people are treated worse, and these social factors are leading to worse health outcomes for those people in northern climates. Okay, but an alternative explanation, or at least one alternative explanation, is that there are biological differences between these different populations that are influencing these health disparities. So, for example, as this paper argues, if these darker skinned people have higher rates of vitamin D deficiency, and vitamin D impacts basically every biological process, as we'll see, then maybe that explains some of the health disparities we see between whites and non-whites. All right, another reason that this paper matters is because people like to say that race is just about skin color, and that's like the only difference by race, which again, that's sort of a message that's been preached in European countries to make people more accepting of non-white immigrants and things like that. But the reality is, even if the only difference by race was skin color, which it isn't, then there would be many other biological differences that are downstream of that. Because again, differences in skin color lead to differences in vitamin D deficiency. And vitamin D, again, that vitamin impacts the expression of thousands of different genes in the human genome in pretty much every organ system. All right. So again, race, if it was just skin deep, that would still lead to a lot of other differences between races, but it's not just skin deep. All right, so that's why it matters. We're going to get into the paper now. So first of all, they start off by describing in the abstract the differences between African Americans and European Americans in terms of vitamin D deficiency. So it says African Americans have much higher rates of many diseases and higher mortality. And they have a much higher rate of severe vitamin D deficiency, 15 to 20 times higher rates of severe vitamin D deficiency. Now, why does that matter? Because, as they say here, there's evidence that vitamin D, this is the active form right here, this 25-hydroxyvitamin D, okay? Those levels or supplementation with vitamin D, that influences everything from mortality rate, which basically just means death rate, the likelihood of having an adverse pregnancy or birth outcome. So if mothers who are pregnant or expectant mothers, if they have vitamin D deficiency, then they're more likely to have an issue with their pregnancy or with the birth of their child. Cancer rates, so higher vitamin D deficiency means higher likelihood of getting cancer. Diabetes, Alzheimer's, dementia, other brain-related problems that we'll talk about. Autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis, infectious diseases and immune function, and bone issues also. So we're going to talk about all of that and more, but this is just to indicate that vitamin D really is involved in many different biological processes. So given that there are very extensive differences in vitamin D deficiency across race, that probably explains a lot of the differences in biological outcomes related to all these health metrics. Okay. So they give a little, overview and introduction. We're going to skip a lot of that. So here they talk about why skin pigmentation is different across different populations. We already mentioned that, and it's kind of obvious, but basically dark skin is an adaptation for climates near the equator where sunlight is very intense. Because again, the dark skin, the melanin there, it helps block the ultraviolet light and therefore protects the skin from, as it says here, one, sunburn, but DNA damage is the big one in skin cancer. Okay, but then it says later, as people migrated into Europe, there was selection for lighter skin, of course, because while you want to block a lot of UV light in order to protect the DNA and things like that, you also do need some to get through in order to activate that vitamin D precursor and help convert that into active vitamin D. So light skin is an adaptation for high latitude climates. Okay. And so now there's what they describe as basically a skin tone latitude mismatch, where dark-skinned people are moving to higher latitude areas with immigration, and that's causing a mismatch between their evolutionary history and their biology and the new environment that they're in, and that's causing health problems. So the effects of vitamin D deficiency is just one example of that. Maybe we'll talk about some other climate mismatches in future videos. Okay, but their biology is not as compatible with high latitude climates as it is with the environments where they evolved, which makes sense. All right, so it goes to talk on a little bit more about how vitamin D is synthesized. Again, we don't really need to worry about that. Let's see. The big first figure to pay attention to is this one here. Okay, and so what this figure is showing is basically level of vitamin D deficiency along the x-axis. So the further to the left it is, the more deficient they are in vitamin D. And then the further it goes to the right, the more vitamin D they have in their blood. So this is like a measuring vitamin D levels in their blood. And they've separated the population into these 4 categories, either people who are seriously deficient in vitamin D, like moderately deficient, or what they classify as insufficient or sufficient levels of vitamin D in their blood. And then along the y-axis, that's percent of people in that category belonging to that group. So the black bars are black people, so African Americans. So 17% of all African Americans in this sample were seriously deficient in vitamin D, meaning they had levels below this threshold here. Okay, 4% of Hispanics were in that category, and only 1% of white people were in that category of seriously deficient. If you move over to just moderately deficient or regular deficiency, 58% of black people in America fit into that category. 41% of Hispanics did, and only 19% of white people did. If you move over and look at this category of insufficient, 21% of blacks are in there, 43% of Hispanics are in there, and 45% of whites are in there. And if you look at who has sufficient levels of vitamin D, only 4% of African Americans had sufficient vitamin D levels, according to this study. 13% of Hispanics fell into this category, and 35% of whites fell into this category. Okay, so you can clearly see here that there are strong racial differences in vitamin D deficiency or sufficiency, and that's almost certainly driven by differences in skin tone. Okay, the biological mechanism there is completely clear. And I should mention now that it's believed the differences in skin tone is genetic. So there are hundreds of genes involved in skin pigmentation, and there are clear variants across the different races. Okay, so this is truly a biological difference that we see today, born out of genetic differences that were caused by different ancestral conditions in which these populations evolved. Then it gets into all the different effects of this. Okay, so it talks about different health factors that have been implicated as being affected by vitamin D deficiency. Okay, so they talk about skeletal health and how that might be affected. We're not going to do a deep dive into all of these because there's too many. But if we go down, we see this one's relevant and important. So they talk about how vitamin D deficiency influences pregnancy and early development. So they note that African American women are at higher risk for many pregnancy-related problems. And so that's all shown here in this first table. So C-section delivery, cesarean section delivery, that usually happens if there's a problem during pregnancy. The mothers elect to do that instead of vaginal delivery. And it then shows what percent of people by ethnicity had that pregnancy outcome. So you see 35.9% of black pregnant women had cesarean delivery, whereas only 30.9% of white women did. Okay, and so what really matters here is sort of this column, the ratio of black women to white women who had that particular pregnancy outcome. So if it's a number above 1, that means it's higher in the black women, and if it's below 1, that would mean it's higher in the white women. But as you can see, all of these pregnancy complications, they're higher in black women compared to white women. And as we're gonna talk about in a minute, vitamin D is thought to contribute to a lot of that. So according to this, black women are almost 4 times more likely to die in the hospital during childbirth compared to white women. Okay, there's all these other health problems, like black women are more likely to give rise to a low birth weight infant compared to white women, and a few other health problems. So how does this relate to vitamin D? Well, they go on to discuss that down here in each of these bullet points, but it's known that pregnant women with darker skin have lower vitamin D levels. Again, this is just indicating vitamin D, the active form, compared to women with lighter skin. Okay, so that's just a correlation. They observe that people with darker skin, when they're pregnant, they have lower vitamin D levels. But then they talk about other studies that have been linked to each of these pregnancy complications. So for example, they talk here about how vitamin D has been implicated in children being born who are small for their age. In other words, basically giving birth to an offspring that is smaller than they should be. That's a sign of poor health for the infant. Okay. So again, we're not going to go through like all the details of all of this because that would take a long time. But they talk about how vitamin D has also been implicated in preterm birth. So basically giving birth earlier than you should, which is also associated with poor health among the offspring. Okay. But they say, in an analysis of 18 different studies, having low maternal vitamin D levels is associated with basically higher risk of preterm birth. Again, the details don't matter too much. Just know higher vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy means more likely to give birth to a child early, which is bad for it. Okay, they give some more details here. They talk about, and we'll get into more of this in a minute, but they talk about how vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy on the part of the mother might influence the offspring's risk of neurodevelopmental problems like autism or ADHD, and a variety of other potential problems. Okay, so this has very important implications because if there are racial differences in vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy, and vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy causes neurological problems and neuropsychiatric developmental issues, then that could potentially explain why there are neurobiological differences by race, or at least it could partially explain that, and neurobehavioral differences and psychiatric differences, which are very important. Okay. So there's this other paper that looked at this too. We're not going to go through this paper in any detail, but just looking at the abstract at the end, basically they looked at a bunch of different studies and analyzed all their data collectively. And what they said is that basically prenatal, so before birth, so during pregnancy, the mother's vitamin D levels were associated with better cognition among their offspring, psychomotor development, autism, and they say there was little evidence for its effects on like language development. But the point is, vitamin D deficiency during pregnancy is linked to a lot of different neurobiological and neurobehavioral outcomes. So this could potentially explain some behavioral differences we see by race too. So that makes it very important. Okay, and I think we're going to talk about some of those papers specifically in future videos. All right. Likewise, with cesarean delivery, low vitamin D levels are linked to that too. All right, so that's all pregnancy complications. Next, they talk about cancer. Okay, so African Americans have higher rates of most types of cancer and higher mortality for that cancer. So this includes bladder cancer, breast cancer, colon cancer, endometrial cancer, lung, ovary, pancreas, prostate, rectum, testes, and vagina, and Hodgkin's lymphoma. Okay, so a lot of different cancer types, African Americans have higher risk. All right, and higher mortality. So not only are they more likely to get it, they're also more likely to die from it. All right, now what's causing this? It could be multiple factors. There's multiple potential explanations for this. But one of them, again, comes back to vitamin D deficiency. So it's known that sunlight exposure is inversely related to most cancers. So in other words, if you're more exposed to sunlight, you're actually less likely to get most cancers, okay, with the exception being skin cancer. Okay, but this is really, the authors are implying, a proxy for vitamin D deficiency. So higher exposure to sun means lower vitamin D deficiency, and lower vitamin D deficiency means basically better protection against cancer. And they go on to make that argument further down here. So let's see. If you basically look specifically at people with low vitamin D, across both black and white people, then their cancer rates are similar. So in other words, if you correct for vitamin D differences between whites and blacks, then the cancer rates become more similar. So that strongly suggests that vitamin D is playing an important role in the differences in cancer susceptibility. Okay, this table is showing basically the same, it's basically the same format as the previous table about the birth defects, but this is showing the racial differences in different cancer types by both males up in this top group and females down here. So again, pay attention to the black to white ratio. The higher that ratio, basically the more this particular cancer type is present in black people compared to white people. So like right here, stomach cancer, it's almost twice as likely in black people as it is in white people, for men at least. Okay. So, you could take some time and look at that table if you want, but the point is simply that African Americans have much higher rates of most cancer types. And it's thought that this is due to differences in vitamin D deficiencies. And so they give their evidence for why they think all of this is related to vitamin D down here. We're not going to go into it because, again, that would just take a long time. The study is pretty dense with information. You can read it yourself if you're interested. All right, so next up is diabetes. So they talk about how vitamin D deficiency might be linked to differences in diabetes by race. So it says, in the United States, total diabetes is approximately twice as high among non-Hispanic blacks and Hispanics compared to non-Hispanic whites. So again, white people have lower rates of diabetes. And they talk about how there's this study where if you supplement people with vitamin D dietarily, that basically improves certain parameters indicative of diabetes. Okay, so like this is this HbA1c, that's basically hemoglobin that's been bound by sugar, okay, which is an indicator of diabetic phenotypes. Okay, so basically you give them vitamin D that diminishes symptoms of diabetes. So it seems that they're the higher rates of vitamin D deficiency among blacks and Hispanics is probably contributing to differences in diabetes rates. All right, they go on to make that argument in greater detail throughout this section. Okay, but it's also worth pointing out that other metabolic diseases are also related to this. So like obesity, African Americans have higher rates of obesity compared to white Americans. And so that could be potentially a confounding factor here because obesity is also associated with like lower vitamin D levels. Okay. So next, they very briefly talk about cardiovascular disease. They say that there's an inverse relationship between serum levels of vitamin D and cardiovascular disease. But apparently this is a little bit less clear of a relationship. Vitamin D also seems to play a role in preventing neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's. So they talk about how, there's been analyses done where they look at the relationship between vitamin D levels in the blood and risks of dementia. And having higher vitamin D is associated with lower risk of dementia. So it could be the case that because of racial differences in vitamin D deficiency, that leads to racial differences in neurodegeneration and potentially cognitive function. All right, they talk about the relationship between vitamin D and autoimmune diseases like multiple sclerosis. Again, we don't need to go into the details, but basically there seems to be a relationship between vitamin D and autoimmune function. Similarly, there's a relationship between vitamin D levels and infectious diseases, where higher vitamin D levels are associated with lower rates of infectious disease and better immune function. Okay, so if you remember during COVID, there was a lot of complaint that there were racial differences in the incidence of COVID. Well, one potential explanation for that is differences in vitamin D levels across different populations. All right, so they do have one more section that we're going to discuss, and that's how vitamin D deficiency relates to all-cause mortality, which basically just means likelihood of dying in general, death rates overall. Okay, and basically it's the case that African Americans have higher mortality rates, so they're dying sooner, and they're more likely to die of most different chronic diseases. So what this graph here is showing is basically relative to white Americans, how much more likely are African Americans to die at a given age. So this first bar is showing that they're about 50% more likely to die just overall. And a significant portion of this is due to heart disease. So they're almost 80% more likely to die of heart disease during this age window. They're like 140% more likely to die of cancer than white people at this age window. Cerebrovascular disease, they're slightly more likely to die from that. They're almost 100% more likely to die of complications related to diabetes. Okay, and the reason this relates to vitamin D deficiency is because there are studies that have shown that vitamin D levels are basically just linked to mortality in general, such that people with the highest levels of vitamin D, they have the lowest mortality rate, and vice versa. So people who have the lowest levels have the highest mortality rate. So vitamin D in general is just associated with higher longevity and longer lifespan. Okay. So that's basically the paper. We don't need to worry about this. It's basically showing a similar thing where higher vitamin D levels means lower mortality. Okay. But that's the paper. It's worth emphasizing that this is by no means all that vitamin D is involved in. So you could go to Google Scholar and just type in vitamin D deficiency and pick your health outcome. So we can do like digestive health. And what you're going to find is that there are many, many papers, thousands of papers talking about pretty much every possible health outcome. Okay. So vitamin D deficiency is linked to worse digestive function, immune function. Same thing. There are thousands of papers talking about vitamin D and its relation to immune function. You could do brain function. Okay. And again, it's important for neurodevelopment. So if you have vitamin D deficiency in early life or prenatally or even in adulthood, that can influence brain function and behavior in important ways. Okay. So it truly is important to understand that there are differences in vitamin D deficiency across different populations. Vitamin D deficiency rates are higher among African Americans compared to white Americans, and this likely explains a lot of the behavioral, psychological, and physical differences between our populations. Okay, so again, the reason this matters is because it shows, one, even if race was just skin deep, it would have consequences that extend well beyond the skin, to include even the brain and behavior and psychology. Okay? And it shows that it's not white racism causing all these health problems among Africans and other dark-skinned people. It's the fact that there's a mismatch between their evolved biology and the environments that they're now in. Again, it's not white people's fault. We need to combat that narrative because the idea that it's all white people's fault is being used to instill white guilt in white people, which is being used to basically turn us into second-class citizens in our own homes and ruin our civilizations. So we need to combat that narrative. So thank you for listening.